easily, it was my favorite restaurant ever. It's probably been gone 20, 25 years. The Classic Cup in Westport was just this delightful little space and just charming. And they had the best vegetarian food there. Not very many things, but a couple. And we would go there on Sunday after church. And this was in the early years when I was starting St. Andrew, that 9 years when we were in a school gym, and we'd get up early and we'd put signs out, and then we'd go get the trailer from some of the storage shed or the Goodwin's garage, and we'd haul it there and we'd unload and we'd preach and then load it back up and do the same thing, take the signs down. And by the time we got to the Classic Cup in Westport, I was just exhausted. And it was almost like they had a camera in the parking lot, because we would walk in there and there would be this perfect table in the corner. There would be my iced tea right there, and Kevin, who was the amazing host who died just a few months ago of many years battling AIDS, and it was so welcoming. And then Sue, who was, I think, in law school or working at Shook at the time, I swear, she was also a waiter. And we would go in there and she would just know, you're gonna want the vegetarian strata. And then she would bring out chocolate bread. Most people got chocolate bread, one little piece and like a couple of maybe little muffins. No, just chocolate bread. And it was just this feeling of feeling so incredibly nurtured and cared for. I thought about that this week, reading this passage, and I thought about other experiences like that. When I was in seminary, there was a Methodist foundation, the Wesley Foundation, and there was a wonderful campus minister, and on Thursday nights they had free food. And none of the TCU undergrads needed free food, but all the seminarians, we needed free food. So we would go in there and they would have this casserole. It was the same thing. It was like broccoli and cheese and rice. And it was like a bottomless pit of broccoli. It was just so much. And it was just so nurturing. We loved this minister. We felt so cared for him. Then I thought about when I had Eden, and this guy showed up at the front door with this thing of black bean soup. I don't think they make Tupperware that big anymore. It was I think she was 1 before I had made it through that black bean soup. And it was the best black bean soup I have ever had. So Jesus shows up this morning and he says, "What do you got to eat?" Now to be totally honest, I don't really think it's fair to say Jesus was just kind of a tired pastor or a tired parent. He had a week, right? The way the gospel writer of Luke tells it, he'd been betrayed. Then he'd been arrested, then he'd been denied 3 times, then he'd been beaten and mocked, then he'd been sentenced, and then he'd been crucified, and then he'd been resurrected, and then right now he's reappeared, right? And the disciples are still clueless. She's gone through all that, and he's having to tell them what's going on. He's having to explain over the table. He takes the bread, he blesses and breaks and gives it to them, and then they keep on, and then now they've gone back to Jerusalem, and now Jesus reappears to them with that great line, "Peace be with you." And they're startled and terrified. And so he says, kind of like the Gospel of John, that same scene in there, he's like, "Look, I'm not a ghost. Look, see flesh and bones. A ghost doesn't have flesh and bones." And then it says, this is a great line, disbelieving in their joy. Disbelieving and wondering in their joy. Have you ever had that kind of where you just can't even believe it and there's so much joy? I remember, again, right when Eden was going to be born, and the doctor said to me, "You're going to have a baby." And I was like, really? It was just you couldn't believe it, right? What was all this about? And then that feeling, right? Or maybe the doctor says, "There's no cancer," right? Maybe you see something you just can't even believe, and there's just such this feeling of disbelief and joy. And then Jesus, an absolutely great line, says, "What do you got to eat?" It's a great line. And, a lot of scholars would say, well, this isn't really about the body. It doesn't really have anything to do with that. This is really just a way of saying, hey, Jesus is not just the way we might remember our mother when we bake her oatmeal raisin cookies, even though she's been gone for 50 years. This is not that. And this is not like the way you're walking through, the woods and you find an arrowhead and you feel almost like Uncle Fred, who had such a collection of arrowheads, is right there with you. No. This is not what that is. This resurrection is unlike anything you could ever even imagine, right? But I still think there were a big part of those first early gatherers, early people who were trying to say, whatever the resurrection is about, it's about the body. What difference does it make, right? What difference does it make if it doesn't call us to act in love and grace when we hear about the famine in Sudan and Gaza, right? what difference does a resurrection make if it doesn't call us to care for one another when our bodies are broken and bruised? What difference does it make if it doesn't call us to love and affirm ourselves? So there was always this part of the gospel that really believed that, the wholeness of the body, that God cared about the earth, that God cared about us. I remember when I was in seminary, and we had this professor come from Harvard, and her name was Margaret Miles. This was like in 1985. There were very few women who were like teaching religion anywhere, especially at a place like Harvard. She might have been in her 50s and 60s. She was absolutely gorgeous, absolutely. You know the way only older people can be so gorgeous when they've lived this life of grace. And she was in like the early church fathers, patristics. And I remember she showed these slides. This was back in the day when people showed slides. And she was talking about in the earliest Christian communities, like the earliest caves, they would find these like colonies, like leprous colonies, right? And they had painted their chapel area with pictures of Jesus. And of course, his skin was leprous, right? Just like them. And then the pictures of the resurrection, and they were gathered there and their bodies were all healed. I mean, it's like the whole resurrection matters because it's like God's way of saying all of who we are matters. And that's something that we probably picked up from our Jewish roots. Judaism doesn't have this strong separation between the body and the earth, between body and heaven or something like that. You think about the Shabbat. What are you supposed to do on the Sabbath if you're Jewish? You celebrate, you light candles, you feast, you're with your family, you make love. It's all about a celebration of the physical. But somehow Christianity went awry. And if anybody's going to ask you on Jeopardy, what's the biggest mistake that Christianity ever made? What's the worst doctrine ever? It would be dualism. Now, that word doesn't exactly roll off your tongue, but dualism is kind of this Christianity that says, really, we're about getting into heaven, and people starving and being hungry doesn't really matter, okay? Because we're about heaven. And dualism is this kind of probably something we picked up, Gnostic, Greco-Roman. Brad Chance can lead a class on it. I don't really remember it all, but it is huge, and it is massively huge. It is massively huge right now in the Christian right and all that. It just keeps getting worse. So it's this idea that you have heaven, which we should all aspire to, which is about the spirit and purity and holiness and men, white straight men, to be honest. And we have the earth, and the earth is about flesh and sin and impurity, women, and all of those things, right? I mean, that's true, right? And so let me just say it this way. We didn't go from Jesus one day to a celibate priesthood the next day, right? As of the 12th century, folks, it would take a long time to kind of get this development so that like our bodies aren't really good, they don't really matter, we need to put them away. And if you think that doesn't matter, well, look up the rates of kids who've got some kind of eating disorder, right? Or look at how many young people believe that their body is beautiful and affirm it. Look at how we struggle to care about ourselves, right? Look at the way we have separated out the mind. And I do it too. I'll say like, well, he has a mental illness. No, he has an illness of the mind and the body. We're all one thing, right? But we've separated it out. And now we've got, this really ridiculous ideas where we, denigrate the body or hurt the body, and it comes out in so many ways. And then how can you bomb the hell out of people, right? Unless you denigrate the body, unless you think somehow your body matters, but the other, how can you do what these fossil fuel people do? Really, folks, I mean, the plastics and all of that, if you on some level don't ascribe to this ridiculous theology that this earth doesn't really matter and someday we're going to fly away, right? No. This is all one thing. And the reality is there was always a group of early Christians and followers who ascribed to that. Because this passage, Jesus says, what do you got to eat? And they say, I got some fish. Some of that is like it's baked, it's broiled, it's roasted. But there's also some early traditions. It's not the most original, right? It's not the most earliest, like if you've got an earlier version, of Luke's gospel somewhere, that's worth money. But in the earliest versions, it's fish. But there are early versions, like really early, where they add in and a hunk of honeycomb, right? That's in the King James Version. I mean, like it's in these early versions where Jesus says, what do you have to eat? And they say, how's some fish and how about a hunk of honeycomb, right? Because who wants to give Jesus just a fish dinner? You want to give him some honey cake too. And I mean, that's early, folks. That's really early on. Early on, there were people who thought the body is to be lavished and and adored. I mean, I've told you this every morning when I go out and run, I think to myself, there is going to come a time when it's the last day I'll be able to do this. Last day. You're supposed to say that when you're unloading the dishwasher too. The day will come when last day I'll ever be able to do this. I mean, what a beautiful thing that our bodies carry us and bear us, and how precious is every single child. How can we go through the day not thinking about how do we make sure all the children in this city have enough to eat and can flourish? I mean, how can we stand it, right? Because every single body is beautiful and blessed and cherished. Dawn Staley. Talk about disbelieving in joy. You know who she is? She's the coach of the South Carolina Gamecocks. I usually don't like a lot of talk about God and all that from faith people. Dawn Staley, she can talk about God all she wants, right? I mean, you know, she's this one, she dances, talking with the players, she's so disciplined. I mean, last Sunday, I think most of us, since I was in our backyard, probably cheering for Alwyn and Caitlin Clark, but who can be against Dawn Staley in South Carolina, right? I mean, they went 38-0, and she didn't have one starter returning. And you see her, and talk about somebody who's got an idea of what an inclusive, beautiful body looks like, right? And she's up there, she's dancing, she's chopping down the net. She's like, at a time, let me just say, a lot of smarter people than me have commented on this. Isn't it interesting that just at a time when women have lost their control over their bodies, that people are turning in to watch women's sports? There's a connection there, because it's a way of people saying, you know what, we're human beings, that we've got power, we've got strength. But Dawn Staley, she's not the only amazing coach in South Carolina. A couple of weeks ago, Kay walked up, said to me, did you see that story about the coach at University of South Carolina, the men's team? She was telling me about it, and I was like, talk about disbelieving in joy. Are you sure? Sure enough, I saw the story. It wasn't actually University of South Carolina, the main team. It was a smaller junior college. The story was about this team. They didn't play last year because they'd had 4 coaches in 8 months. The last coach had quit before he even stepped on campus. It said the ad could have been the worst job in college basketball. The pay, he got $38,000. That's not a lot. You know, there was no recruiting budget. There was no staff. The gymnasium that they used was 7 feet short of regulation. There was no shower in the men's locker room, and there was no toilet. And, you know, the locker room looked terrible. When he got the job, he got his mom and family to come and help him, you know, kind of build it. And then there was also the issue that he had no players. So he decided the best way to get a player would be to go across the ocean, where people might not know that University of South Carolina at Salkehatchie is not really a desirable place. So he ended up with 5 Australians, 4 South Carolinians, someone from England, Germany, Costa Rica, and Virginia. And sure enough, you know, they went to the tournament. It was a remarkable story. But the big part of the story, and the reason it was in the New York Times, was because Matt Lynch broke a barrier because he became the first openly gay coach ever. And college basketball, pro basketball, any kind of professional sport, the first man. Not a single other gay coach in men's basketball, football, anything like head coach. And it was just an incredibly beautiful story about, you know what, how he'd been embraced. There was no denigration from the players, no catcalls from the opponents. Everybody in the little bitty town of South Carolina, Walterboro, South Carolina, 5,544 people, they were just super happy to have a winning team. What does the resurrection really mean, right? If it doesn't mean something about all of us loving our bodies and loving one another and working as hard as we can for a world where every single person can be embraced and loved by the God of resurrection power. Amen. Amen.